The investigation into that deadly plane crash in the French Alps is focusing on one man, the pilot who allegedly brought the jet down deliberately with 149 other people on board.
On March 24, 2015, a routine flight from Barcelona to Düsseldorf became a nightmare. Germanwings Flight 9525, carrying 150 souls, plunged into the French Alps, leaving behind a trail of shock, grief, and unanswered questions. This is the story of Andreas Lubitz, a young man with a dark secret, a story of ambition, mental health, and a system that failed to see the cracks in its facade. So let's unravel the mystery from the beginning. It started as an ordinary morning on March 24, 2015 for Germanwings Flight 9525. An Airbus A320 with 144 passengers and 6 crew members on board. At 9:27 a.m, the plane departed Barcelona en route to Düsseldorf. Checking in with the Marseille Area Control Center, the captain calmly read back clearances from air traffic control to proceed on course at 9:30 a.m. But just minutes later, controllers noticed something amiss. The plane had rapidly descended nearly 2,000 feet. Repeated radio calls to the flight went unanswered, leaving controllers alarmed and confused as Flight 9535 continued its unauthorized and puzzling descent through the skis over the French Alps. Tension mounted at the Marseille Control Center as the plane dropped off radar at 9:40 a.m. after flying below detectable altitudes without receiving any distress calls. Over the next agonizing half-minute, controllers desperately tried contacting Flight 9525 on multiple frequencies, even enlisting help from an Air Force controller and a nearby aircraft, but only static and chilling silence answered back. Minute by minute, the plane continued its ghostly descent below radar visibility, severing all communication. Controllers could only watch helplessly as the bright blip on their screens faded away for a final time at 9:40 a.m. No sign of where the aircraft had gone or why. Gripped by the nightmare unfolding, French air traffic control sounded the alarm for immediate emergency assistance. Yet just 60 seconds later, their worst fears were sickeningly confirmed. Germanwings Flight 9525 had crashed into an alpine mountainside, vanishing without a trace or single distress call until its annihilation among the rocky crags at 9:41 a.m. The plane had vanished into craggy, remote mountains, accessible only by helicopter for emergency crews arriving at a devastating scene. Scattered across an expansive debris field, all that remained of Flight 9525 were small, shredded fragments. Investigators combing the wreckage recovered the damaged black box recorders. As they reconstructed the flight data, a shocking revelation took form. This was no accident, but a hijacking. Yet how could that be, with no terrorist organization taking credit? Piecing together the timeline, authorities traced the cascade of events back to 9:30 a.m. when the captain had stepped out of the cockpit. Practically the moment he left, an unauthorized change in the plane's altitude was entered, beginning its calamitous descent. Just 4 minutes later, the captain returned to the fortified cockpit door, now mysteriously locked against him. Utter horror washed over the captain as he stared helplessly at the locked cockpit door. The unthinkable slowly dawned on him. His own co-pilot had hijacked the aircraft. The twin safeguards established after 9/11 to protect pilots from external attacks had tragically enabled a threat from within. To prevent unapproved access, cockpit steel doors were armored and code-locked. Crews could ring the cockpit and punch in a code to unlock the door for 30 seconds. And that was the failsafe the co-pilot activated, locking out all emergency access while sending the plane into its unauthorized descent. Now locked out, the captain was left powerlessly pounding on the armored door as the plane plunged. The cockpit recorder captured the helpless captain desperately trying to break back in as the minutes ticked by. The passengers and crew inside realized to their horror that regaining control was impossible. At 9:41 a.m, Flight 9525 was intentionally flown straight into a mountain at the hands of its own co-pilot. Among the 150 lost souls aboard were an entire classroom of schoolchildren returning from a celebratory trip to Spain. The seasoned captain, 34-year-old Patrick Sondenheimer, was a dedicated pilot and father of 2 young daughters. In the aftermath, his grieving wife established a foundation in his name to help youth process tragedy, a bittersweet legacy for a man who spent his final moments desperately trying to wrest back control. In tragic irony, the man who sealed the plane's deadly fate was 27-year-old co-pilot Andreas Lubitz. Lubitz had dreamed of flying since childhood. His room was a shrine to air travel. He enrolled straight into Lufthansa's elite flight academy after school. But just months into training, his dream collapsed as he sank into severe depression and a leave of absence. Lubitz spent months under psychiatric care, treated with medications, before finally being declared in remission. After a period of evaluation, his student pilot license was provisionally restored. He could resume classes, but any recurrence of mental health issues would permanently ground him from the skies. Determined, Lubitz continued his pilot training, desperate to outrun the depression that had clipped his wings. But when it came time for Lubitz to apply to an American flight school, deception undid those dreams. On FAA paperwork, he boldly denied ever having a mental illness diagnosis. The falsification was caught, placing not just his aviation career but his very freedom in jeopardy. The discovery of Lubitz's FAA deceit could have grounded his aspirations for good, but likely owing to his previously clean record, the FAA took mercy, giving the distressed pilot a second chance on the condition that he take responsibility for the depression diagnosis. Relieved, Lubitz corrected the paperwork and was still able to attend flight school in America. In 2013, he landed a coveted role at Germanwings Airlines, but tragically, after little more than a year's flying, his old torment returned. Depression again consumed him. He became obsessed with blindness, convinced his vision was failing as halos, flashes of light, and odd visual distortions plagued him. Though multiple specialist visits found little amiss physically, Lubitz spiraled mentally. 2 doctors diagnosed a worsening hypochondriacal disorder and borderline psychosis, warning him to enter psychiatric hospitalization. But terrified of losing flying status again from any hospital disclosure, Andreas numbly and repeatedly refused help. The secrecy had corroded his judgment. In desperation, he returned off books to his original psychiatrist instead. Behind closed doors, Lubitz resumed intensive psychotherapy alongside potent antidepressants, even as he continued reporting for Germanwings flight duties. But privately, his decline accelerated, as reflected in a string of doctor's notes excusing him from work throughout February and March 2015. So 4 fateful days before the crash, Andreas Lubitz turned to research the one instrument of control still under his command, the cockpit security system. Once airborne from Düsseldorf headed towards disaster in Barcelona, Lubitz discreetly tested his knowledge, programming a momentary unauthorized descent while Captain Sondenheimer momentarily exited the fortified enclosure. The dry run confirmed what Lubitz came to believe was his macabre purpose. On the inbound return trip, Lubitz would weaponize the cockpit protections to instead ensure the unfettered mass destruction of Flight 9525. Numbed to the unconscionable human carnage, Lubitz saw only escape for himself. After all, pilots undergo rigorous physical examinations for flying fitness each year, but not so for their complex mental health, which is easier to conceal or overlook until far too late. Pilots self-evaluate and voluntarily report health conditions impacting flight safety, so Lubitz concealed his deteriorating mental state from employers, even as doctors warned him he was unfit to fly. Medical confidentiality limited what doctors could disclose without Lubitz's consent. Yet surely, the psychiatrist treating this profoundly disturbed pilot over months knew keeping his patient flying risked catastrophe. Could he reasonably believe Lubitz is a danger only to himself and no one else? Mental illness alone does not predispose one to violence. Perhaps Lubitz's doctors were paralyzed by indecision, afraid to rupture trust or risk liability for an incorrect call. Violating patient confidentiality is not a simple judgment. Cultural norms valuing privacy may have also stayed their hand. Aviation authorities implemented new psychological evaluation protocols and 2-person cockpit rules after Germanwings 9525. Yet years later, with the tragedy faded from memory, Lufthansa quietly reversed the constant companion policy as unnecessary. Germanwings was rebranded under its parent Eurowings just months after the crash. Though the move predated the Alps disaster, legal settlements provided the victims' families with some compensation, though no dollar amount could truly heal such a profound loss. One wonders if it could have been prevented had the healthcare system wrestled sooner with the moral quandary seated before them. We can only hope society learns from this calamity about the human capacity for destruction when the mind falls ill. Perhaps you, the viewer, will carry that torch for the innocents who saw their final glimpse of the sky 5 years ago over France. If regulations and memory again falter, change starts with awareness. The questions may linger, the pain may never fully subside, but in the face of tragedy, we find resilience. We remember the victims, not for their final moments, but for the lives they lived, the laughter they shared, and the dreams they held. Germanwings Flight 9525 may be gone, but its memory lives on. Let this story not just grip you with its horror, but move you to compassion, understanding, and a vow to make the world a brighter place. This has been Secret Sleuths. Remember the victims, honor their memory, fly safe.